Hello everybody, my name is Matt Edminster, and at Matt's request I am here to to make my contribution to your readings of the Gospel of Mark. And I'm actually really excited to do this because the passage that I've been assigned is a really interesting passage that takes place at a very important time in Jesus' ministry and has, I think, something to say to what we are dealing with today. And so I'll try to tease some of that stuff out. Just would start with this, that at this point in Mark's Gospel, there are a couple of things that are happening. It's really a turning point for Jesus. Until this point, most of his ministry has been in the area of Galilee, which is northern Israel. And now he has gone outside of that region to the north, and he's spending time in pagan or semi-pagan areas that are north of Israel. And so he's dealing with people that are not Jewish, not explicitly Jewish. So they are either practicing some other kind of religion, or they're mixing their Judaism with another kind of religion. So there are a number of reasons given for why he might have done this. Most likely it's because he had become so popular, and we see this in Mark, so popular in the area of Galilee that he was kind of forced to go in a different direction in order to kind of gain some space, perhaps prepare for the next chapter. And it's really kind of this transition to the next chapter of his ministry that that we're seeing in our passage. So we're now in chapter 8, and the verses are 22 to 26. And in this place, Jesus meets with a blind man. So he goes to a town called Bethsaida, and this town is a town from which a number of his disciples were born or raised. I'm not sure which, but I think it's in Luke's gospel that we learn about this. So a number of these disciples are from the area of Bethsaida, and when he arrives in that place, these people bring out a man who is blind, who has been blind. It seems from this story that he wasn't born blind, but rather that he became blind after time. He has some memories, visual memories, associations that he's able to bring to bear. And so when he is healed, in the process of his healing, we see that he has some way of recognizing objects, even though it's not complete. So they bring this guy out, and Jesus asks them to come outside of the town. So they leave the town, they go off into the countryside or into a more private place. He's together now with his disciples, with this man, potentially with the friends that brought him, and the request is to heal him from his blindness. And so Jesus does something that we saw in the previous chapter. In the previous chapter, we saw that he had met a man that was deaf. And in this case, he touched the man's ears, and touched his own tongue, and then touched the other man's tongue. And this was some kind of a transference of healing. Now, in this story, in the story that we're reading today, Jesus does something similar, but in this case, he actually spits in the man's eyes. This is a really strange detail. A number of people have suggested that maybe there's some kind of healing property in spit. But really, I've looked into that, and any indication of that kind of thing comes much later. There is some Jewish tradition, but it's after the time of Christ by at least 100 or so years. There's also in the Roman culture some use of spit for healing properties, but it comes much later. So when Jesus spits in this man's eyes, it calls to mind the same sort of thing that we see when people spit on Jesus when he's going to the cross. And that is disgust. So this is an interesting detail. What is disgusting? Or what is Jesus disgusted by something? Is he indicating that something might be disgusting? Is the man himself disgusting? I don't think so, because Jesus goes to the trouble of healing him. Another interesting thing about this story is that it's the only place that we see Jesus doing a healing that requires two touches. And he asks the man, do you see anything? There's no other place in the stories that we have about Jesus where Jesus asks somebody, so how you feeling? Are you feeling healed? And anything better? Does your back feel better? Your leg feel better? No, I mean, usually the result is immediate. So we see that somebody who didn't see before can now see. Somebody who didn't hear before can now hear. Somebody who couldn't walk before now stands up and jumps around and walks. The effect is immediate. And only in this case does Jesus say, do you see anything? It's a yes or no question. The man could answer, no, I don't see anything. But he says, yes, I do see something. I see people, but they look like trees walking around. And so Jesus a second time puts his hands on him, prays for healing, and then the man is healed completely. And after that, Jesus sends him back to his home and tells him, like he does in many times in Mark, not to go back into the town, but to keep this private. So a lot of very interesting details here. Why is all this happening? This is really the only place where a two-stage healing happens in Jesus' ministry. There's the whole spit thing, and it's happening outside of Israel. Now, one of the keys to understanding this text is realizing where it's placed in the whole story. And I mentioned that this is a turning point where Jesus turns towards Jerusalem. Really, his ministry up until this point is about healing, casting out demons, declaring the nature of the coming kingdom, and himself as Messiah. But as he turns toward Jerusalem, the theme really becomes crucifixion, that the Messiah must suffer, that for the story to be completed the way that God has intended it, the Messiah must suffer and be crucified. And this is, you'll see in a couple of passages, you'll see that this is a disgusting message to Peter. I think that is what's going on here. I think that this healing is less about the man, that the two-stage healing is less about the man than it is about the disciples. That this is a turning point. Part of the reason that Jesus asks the man to come outside of his town is because he's speaking now, he's showing this event specifically to the disciples, to give them some kind of a sense that his ministry is turning towards something that might be difficult for them to understand and perceive. And just as for this man, there was a difference between sight and perception, so too for the disciples. They have seen, they have followed, they have believed, but they don't perceive completely what Jesus is up to. And it could be that in the next chapter they will be somewhat disgusted with the outcome. It's not what they had signed up for. There's, of course, lots that we can say about this passage, but in Mark's Gospel, I would say there are two things that are takeaways for me from this whole passage. One is that in Mark's Gospel, he is presenting us with three different groups of people. And the question is, which group do you belong to, O reader? One group is the crowds. The crowds are just like this man. They've heard that Jesus can do these amazing things, and they come out anytime he arrives in town. They bring their sick and their demon-possessed out, and they hear him teach, and they're happy to receive what he's giving. But they don't always understand it, and they don't necessarily follow him. The disciples are another group. They've been selected by Jesus, and they are intent on not only taking part, but also participating and understanding as much as they can. And Jesus takes time to explain to them things that maybe other people don't get right off the bat. He will take them aside and explain what he's doing. So their path is more intensive. It's also more purposeful. And then there's a third group, which is the opposition group, and we come across these. This is marked mostly by the Pharisees, which is a group of educated, very serious Jewish kind of scholars who are opposed to what Jesus is teaching, what he's doing, what he's claiming about himself and about the kingdom of God. And so they are the opposition to Christ. And now at this point, we don't see the opposition in this scene. We see a man who represents the crowds, and we see Jesus' disciples. They're actually not mentioned, but they're there with him, watching and in the background. And one question for you and I is, which group do you place yourself in? Are you somebody who's interested in watching Jesus from a distance, or are you a follower? Are you intent on following and being changed by him? And if you I put myself in that category. I'm intent on following and being changed as well. So if you're in that category, the second question is, are you perceiving or are you just seeing? And this has been a question for me lately because in all of the race issues that have come up in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I'm very cognizant of the fact that I do not understand the black experience in the United States. I'm aware of things like racism. I'm aware that I'm a privileged person by virtue of the fact that I'm white and male and grew up in a stable and economically stable family and socially stable family. That I have two parents that have been married all their life, or that have never broken up. These are points of privilege for me. How that is connected with the difficulties that black people face is something that's difficult for me to understand, because I don't perceive. I see it. I have black friends that I relate with very well. I don't consider myself to be racist, but I am concerned that the situation would be rectified, that there would be a better outcome. And I realize that I don't perceive everything that I need to perceive to be a part of that story. So I would say that today, as we come to this passage and think about it, that the two-stage healing and the difficulty of moving forward, that if you consider yourself to be a follower of Christ, that you also consider the possibility that there are some things that you do not yet perceive that might, when you do perceive them, present a real challenge to you. What if equality requires that I give up some of my privilege, some of my prestige, some of the things that I've simply inherited and never had to work for? What if it means that there's an economic burden that I begin to bear because wealth needs to be shared? It could be something that feels disgusting, like having spit in your eyes. But the goal is to perceive and to follow and be changed by Christ. So blessings to you all. Any friend of Matt's is a friend of mine. I'm glad I got to spend this time with you today, and I hope that this short message is a blessing to you. Take care.